I don't know if I'll be controversial with saying this, but I believe conversational AI per se is in its infancy.
It's always like when somebody's upset and they want something, the first thing we say is humans like, slow down. What's going on?
You can't predict every utterance, but you can set boundaries. So I asked him, I said, "What is it you want more than anything else?" And he said, without even hesitating a nanosecond, "I want people to use what I build."
Hi there, and welcome to Unprompted, a conversation series by Conversation Design Institute, where we explore the craft, the practice, and the future of conversational AI with the people shaping it. I'm Hans Fernand, I'm the CEO of CDI, and in today's episode of Unprompted, I'm speaking with Nandini Stocker, conversation systems leader with over 25 years of experience designing for voice and chat across 60 languages and 120 countries. So she holds a patent on adaptive dialogue systems at Google, to building India's first culturally adaptive e-commerce assistant at Flipkart, to setting tone and safety guardrails for LLM-powered systems today at USAA. Nandini has been shaping the way AI speaks for long before most of us knew what a chatbot was. Today, we'll explore how the technology is finally caught up with the vision of seasoned conversation designers and what that means for empathy, governance, and the future of our craft. It's so great to have you with us today, Nandini.
Thanks, Hans.
Yeah, so we're gonna.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and it's early. I appreciate you getting up. You're on the West Coast, so it's early for you, and we're really glad you're here with us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about like the technology catching up and basically what you call going from Legos to Play-Doh, which is kind of fun because when I was a kid, I played with Play-Doh long before I played with Legos, so it's almost like an inversion there. But before we kick it off, like, what's the belief about conversational AI that you had to change recently? That so much is changing. So, what's the belief that you had that changed recently?
Well, when it kind of hit the ground running, I had really high hopes. And so I thought, "Oh, this is gonna be it. When I try it out, it would have solved all our problems." But, when I started first working with the new LLM systems, I kind of thought that they'd feel natural out of the box and that they'd handle basic conversation structure, and that we could just trust them to handle all the back and forth. I thought, "Okay, we're gonna be doing more,
Mm.
painting than drawing or whatnot." But when I started working with them, especially, in voice, I'm not sure if they've all been trained mostly on chat or on text, but I realized that, the out of the box behavior that I've seen has really been it seems like it's trained on some of the old legacy IVR systems that don't behave that we've been trying to get past, right? So I think it's mainly things like over prompting, giving long lists of options, like turn taking that kind of is filled up with instructions so the user doesn't have a chance to jump in, that sort of thing. So that structure that fits with like a voice conversation, I feel still has a lot of work to be done. So I'll give you a quick example that's outside of, say, an IVR. Like if you're ordering coffee, and if you walk up to the barista and they say something like, "What would you like to drink? We have hot coffees, cold drinks, 4 milks, like 3 sizes, your choice of flavors,"
Yeah.
um, and then you can finally answer, right? But I'm seeing so many of these systems over and over again where I try it out and it does something like that when it should just say, "Hey, we can make your coffee to order or suggest something new. What can I get started for you today?" So I really the belief I really felt challenged, was that we still have our work cut out for us, and, this is kind of our moment to reset that baseline and maybe start it fresh so that we can do a lot of really great things, with them how we've always envisioned.
Yeah, I like that because it's the. I've also noticed that it seems like these LLMs are mostly trained on public information. So first of all, there's not that many good AI assistants in general that are following good design patterns, and also they're always private, right? They're at these companies. So I think these LLMs are just trained on marketing copy and Wikipedia, so they just lap out these long strings of information. So it's like, yeah, if you can build something based on historic data, but if that historic data it's not necessarily good. It's not going to create a good conversation. Acknowledgement, confirmation prompts, like the basics. If you audit most chatbots in the world, they're not even following those patterns. So like your average is so bad. Like you need to first increase the baseline, use that baseline for training, and then yeah. So I definitely recognize what you're saying, and kind of want to go back to what you said. It's like we used to work with Legos and now we're working with Play-Doh. I'm excited. I'm excited to start building stuff. So what does that mean to you? Take us on the journey here.
Yeah, well, I can appreciate that you feel the analogy could be mixed up. I mean, I even recently explained to my father like how LLMs work, and I said, "Hey, picture, a little girl, a little toddler, and you sit her down at a table with some Legos, and you tell her this is how they fit together, and you can use colors, and then you leave the room, and you come back, and she's built the Eiffel Tower." Right? So he's like, "Oh, okay, this makes sense." Well, I've always loved the Lego analogy because it kinda captures that modular way we've always been designing, bit by bit. At Google, I actually started a group mostly with developers that, we called it VUI Legos, Voice User Interface Legos, where we wanted to templatize things a bit because they felt like we're doing a lot of the same kinds of patterns, but there's no strong structure to it. So how can we do it where we can lift and shift and kind of work with them? We wanted something that was like reusable, extendable, scalable, and all of that was good, but it was like snapping together blocks like Legos, right? Now, precise, reliable, but it's also very rigid. So when you started to want to be really fluid between states, so any designers who's have to try to split a sentence or two parts of a sentence into two different states knows what I'm talking about, right? But fast forward to today, the LLMs, they've kind of shaken that all up and kind of things are a little bit more unpredictable. But I don't know if it's exactly Play-Doh, but the analogy I'm thinking of in my head is that you can mold it in endless ways, but it is also messy. And if you don't have any boundaries, it can kind of collapse into a blob. Uh, but but anyway, that's where designers come in, I feel. So, if we give the Play-Doh form, we give it shape, boundaries, intent, and try to craft more intentional dialogues and so they don't fall into chaos.
Yeah. So when you have the blocks, it's very rigid and structured, but you lose some of the soul of it, where like it doesn't always fit. But if you sort of take like the Play-Doh approach, which we have now, it you have more options, but it doesn't always take the exact shape that you would like it to have.
Exactly.
So your Eiffel Tower might start looking like the Taj Mahal, and you're like, "Ah, it's still a great building, but it's not necessarily what I envisioned here." Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like a way for me to think about it is in the old world, if you draw a triangle, you would draw like 3 lines. Whereas now in this new world, you basically do 3 dots. And it's like the triangle comes from the imaginary, like, so it's like you built the structure for the triangle to emerge rather than the actual rigid triangle. It's kinda like a way that I've been thinking about this is like that. How do how what's really changing there? And then, if you think about that, if this Lego to Play-Doh analogy, what does that mean for the day-to-day on the designer's role or anyone in a conversational AI team? What's changing?
Well, I love that description too, Hans, about the triangle because in effect your brain has to fill in what's missing, right? So I think that it becomes more about, like, yeah, the days of fitting together like block by block, we had to make sure everything was in the right sequence. It was very precise work, but it was also very constrained. When a lot of us who design, sample dialogues early in a project had this whole vision of how this experience could be really great and smooth and fluid. But there's constraints, there's platform constraints and all of that. So creativity, personality, that kind of became more stifled in the existing or older
Yeah.
systems. So with a more malleable toolkit, I think it's the craft itself that's shifting. um, so we don't have to craft every sentence anymore, but we do have to kind of sculpt I'm going a little nuts with the analogy. We have to sculpt kind of the conditions, right, that make those sentences in context. Now it's really all about tone and safety guardrails, building libraries of reusable patterns, not plug and play, but examples and patterns of like this is kind of how
Yeah.
how it should behave. So, it's really working more about designing the rules of engagement, designing, how the overall system should be developed.
Yeah.
And, I sort of see this as instead of being micro crafters of dialogue, we become shapers of systems.
I really like that. Yeah, we're speaking the same language, and how you're talking about it's like, oh wait, yeah, that's also what I'm trying to articulate. Where it's like we initially, like, I think this whole conversational AI thing was about, can we understand what people say? That was like the first thing. It's like, oh, we build technology for that, so that way we can get them somewhere. And then the it was about designing what the system says, and that was kind of like the underutilized lever that you could pull. So if you really think about how it talks, and you can guide the conversations. And now the third wave is basically you're designing the context and the conditions through which the conversation emerges between two entities that you don't control. So we used to not, understand what people said, and we couldn't really understand their input. And now we solved that problem. And now we could control what the system said, and we solved that problem. And now we're dealing with, these massive capabilities, but we don't control entirely what it says. So we got to let go. So now we're basically designing the context for two uncontrollable entities to have conversations, and sort of mitigate that, and dance with that. And the Play-Doh works. I like, it's like like you're basically shaping it, and it's an ongoing relationship that you have with it, because models change, conditions change, and you're basically, yeah, setting the stage for these conversations to take place, which is incredibly exciting. I think the field gets more and more exciting for conversation designers. And so then, if you're basically not, I think we already answered this now, but if you're, what you say, I like the word micro scale. That was the micro scale, writing every prompt hand by hand. In these new worlds, where should the attention go of every designer, everyone entering the field? Like, what's the number one thing maybe that stands out?
Well, it's kind of interesting the course things have taken because Uh, when in the early days when I was, starting out, persona work was really important and really emphasized as a key deliverable in a process, really understand the company that you were designing for. This would have been when I was crafting for, a professional services shop, not immersed in one company like I am now. So I'd have to understand each company we designed for. And so it's really about the conversation designer now is shifting from what to say to how to behave.
Mm.
So this persona work in the past that I'm talking about, it's we would define like the core traits, whether a system should be clear or friendly or warm, all those things. But sometimes that was sort of dismissed as being fluffy, that's kind of fluffy work that's nice, it lives on a sheet of paper. So we do it early in the project, and then we just sort of have to keep those traits in our head and just write them into the dialogue. But now with the system kind of generating the words for us, we have to expose that logic and codify it. So a thoughtful system doesn't overask, and reassures progress. A clear system organizes information into digestible chunks. An easy system hides complexity behind the scenes. These are behaviors that we actually would define into the system, right? And so our role really shifts from writing every word to shaping those rules of engagement, and that's really where we can start to focus on empathy.
Yeah, and basically this would allow us to have empathy at scale then, because you don't have to, like, make sure that every intent that's created, that piece of dialogue has empathy. If the rules of engagement very clearly describe what empathy is, and then I would assume not saying you have empathy, but and that as a rule, but basically really think about that. How does that work when you really want to have empathy at scale with an adaptive system like this? What would that look like?
Well, exactly. It would you couldn't just put, right,
Yeah.
behave with empathy. But, for a long time, we only captured intents and entities, right? So in an emotionally adaptive system, we have to go a level deeper than intent. So I've felt for a long time, and I'm hoping that this is kind of the moment where we get there, is that the utterance itself can be used more because it tells us more than it's more than a signpost of a path you're supposed to take like an intent does. It really signals how to respond in the moment. So I'll take insurance as an example, which is close to home. That, one person who says, "I need to open a new auto claim," is the same intent as someone who says, "My daughter just got in an accident."
Yeah.
But on paper, that intent is the same, but the emotional weight of it is very different, and the system's next step really needs to reflect that. So that's where I see empathy coming in, that we design for we could just it doesn't have to be a heavy emotional AI that does this. We could have, lightweight signals we listen for, urgency words, sentiment markers, things like that. And then guide it whether the system should move fast, whether it should reassure, escalate or slow down, that sort of behavior that we can start to mold it into. And I actually think, to illustrate this best, uh, you don't even have to think of a really dramatic case to see the value. So in an individual conversation, we're always mirroring each other to sort of give that little bit of gentle acknowledgement that we know what you're saying without sounding robotic. So, for example, someone just says something really common like, "I have a question about my bill." They didn't say, "I'm calling about my bill." They said, "I have a question about my bill," right? So you don't you can trigger a billing intent, sure, but if you want I would want the system to mirror and say, "Sure, what kind of billing question do you have?"
Mhm.
Meaning it's reacting to the utterance level and not just kicking off an intent where all
Yeah.
intents sound the same.
Yeah, and I always feel so if you do that, so there's the mirroring statement, which is also like a little, even in the intent world, it's like a little trick because if you mirror the statement, it's basically get confirmation on the intent. So
Yeah.
your mismatch is yeah, your mismatch goes down. But you could say the more emotionally loaded the initial utterance is, the more room you create before you kick off the real journey, because it's often just as simple as having a few extra words before you get to the real content, because when someone's like really upset and they need help, like if you just give them the answer immediately, they don't even hear it, because you first need to address like the emotional thing that is happening and calm it's always like when somebody's upset and they want something, the first thing we say is humans like, slow down, what's going on, right? So you need, like, there's the emotional journey and there's the actual customer journey, and they need to be both addressed. And the more emotional it gets, the basically it you need a little space to deal with that before you can even enter like the real transactional journey of whatever that is, whether it's a question or an actual transaction. So yeah, it seems like it's much easier now to define what that looks like, and to figure out how to do that, because you have more freedom in how you answer the question. And it could just be like like one extra turn in the conversation to deal with the whole emotion framework. Is that kind of how you're thinking about it as well, or am I completely saying something
No,
different?
I like how you characterize that. It's like giving it some breathing room. I like to think in layers. So if we think of maybe 3 layers. So first layer is functional, that we have to get the job done quickly, clearly. So if someone said, "I lost my card," right? The system can act fast, it can lock the card, it can start the replacement process right away. And the second layer is that empathetic layer. So you acknowledge that human side. So if someone says, "My card was stolen and I'm panicking," or if just they said, "My card was stolen," you can still lock and replace it, but you can also reassure. You can say, "I've secured your card so no one can use it, and you'll get the new one is on the way." These are the kinds of empathetic statements that they're they're not substantively accomplishing the task, but they are that empathy layer that's there. And the third layer is escalation. I mean, knowing when to bring in a human, because if like signals that we're getting point to that distress or safety concerns, any kind of high stakes, then, being able to have some place to escalate and make them feel taken care of. You know, everyone's got their automation goals and that, but maybe that person will do that next time, but they need to be taken care of now, which is, so anyway, you can treat those layers as reusable patterns, but you don't have to reinvent empathy every time, but you can apply that sort of layer to the situation.
Yeah. The way I think about those things as well is like conversations to be done in a way. It's like as in jobs to be done. What's actually what is this conversation trying to do? And we often look at, oh, this person has this problem, therefore this is the solution, and then that's it. But that's not necessarily, because what you're saying, the assurance. So they want the card replaced, but they want the assurance that it's handled, which comes with empathy or a way to think about it, because our background's more in behavioral psychology as well, is like, what's the desired behavior of this customer? So you want to solve the problem, but the desired behavior is that they have the confidence that they won't then pick up the phone afterwards and still make sure that it's blocked, right? It's sorted out, right? So if you think about everything that's being created, think about, what's the conversations to be done, or what's the desired behavior of the customer. You're kind of forcing yourself to answer these questions as well. It's like, what does the person really need? It's like, oh wait, yeah, they want to make sure they don't lose their money. Like, they lost a credit card. That's what we're solving for, and that's what we can do with the system. But they actually want the reassurance that they can keep spending because we've already dealt with it, and they can still buy groceries and gifts for their loved ones.
Yeah.
And they want to make sure that nobody else can spend their money. And that's actually why they're calling to solve those two problems. So there's like the surface level of the customer journey, but then there's all these deeper layers, and then you can go really down this rabbit hole of trying to design for that, or you could have very nice, elegant rules of engagement for, kind of how you're describing these different layers, and setting up a system around that, which I guess can scale now much easier.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I guess at Google you did a lot of these standards as well. So is that where you build out these design patterns for, because you were at like 60 different languages. USA, you go through like one specific audience. So you've done like very broad audiences, and now you're in like a very specific audience. Like, how does that relate to each other, and how you approach those kind of design problems then? Because those are very different.
Yeah,
Oh, well,
one is just how to make it work the same thing work across a lot of contexts versus one deep context, which is kind of why I'm exploring this area. I used to do it earlier in my career, but I like the idea of digging deep on one particular set of users, because you learn so much, and be able to really apply to their context. But one of my core beliefs really, and you probably feel this pretty deeply as well, if I'm guessing, is that we need industry-wide standards and, that the whole field needs to level up. At Google, I worked on both sides of that actually. So the external developer community, we created guidelines that they could use in all their different contexts to build across their own conversational systems. The Legos I mentioned before, things like tone principles and accessibility rules, like modular patterns that you could do that with. But at the same time, I also built standards at Google for their own internal solutions that were individually those deep contexts. So for example, the challenge was different if you're an AdWords advertiser versus a Play Store customer versus a Google Fi subscriber, all needing a different kind of care, but they each had their sort of own sub-brands, and the persona and the behavior need to mimic that, but still meeting those baseline requirements. So the experience taught me that, good principles, they can scale in both directions. There's universals like clarity, respect, consistent tone. You can apply that everywhere. But what changes is calibration. So whenever you're designing for a global adaptability, or for the deep specificity, there of a very single audience, like military. Right now, for me, it happens to be military families managing their finances. But the practice is the same. You anchor on the strong standards, then you flex on the more nuanced, calibrated. Here's how design is done. Here's how it is done here for these
Yeah.
individual members.
And is it how much is the core? Is it 80% fundamentals, 20% niche specific? Or like or that would be my ballpark. That would be my guesstimate because it's always like the more you like study one specific set of audience, like the deeper you go, the more you then so there's like we're all the same, then you go deeper. We're all very different, and then you go deeper and deeper, and then we're all the same again. So it's like the core behavioral patterns are always the same. A lot of people either have anxiety or they're excited or they're rushed, and basically, what are the systems of dealing with that? And then you need the layer of making it feel right in that specific context. But you
That's
know,
right. Yeah. Because it's not just who they are, it's what their context and their situation is. That person we just talked about who lost their card or had their card stolen, that doesn't happen to them every day. They call for other things.
yeah,
And so it's not going to handle them in that same way in those different situations. But it's an largely untapped area to be able to be truly contextual like that.
yeah, but I would think that I would say like the fundamentals are like 80%, and then that contextual piece is maybe 20%. I'm thinking now it's like I'm always the same person, but if I go to a different event, maybe one day I'll wear a suit and the other day I'll wear a t-shirt based on where I'm going with you. And like I'll have some adjustments of how casual I am. But at the same time, it's like 80% of it is the same for me. And if you look at like really the conversational patterns that make things work, that slow things down, that take away anxiety, like that motivate people, there's so much the same, and then there's just that little nuance that makes all the difference per in these niches. And so I feel like yeah, and one of the things I always find myself in explain like I'm keen to get your thoughts on that, how you would explain the difference there, where there's building blocks, there's your Legos, and then there's just templates. Because once you start talking about patterns and Lego blocks, people think, oh, you have templates, and they feel like you upload it's like a WordPress theme and you upload it or you change the color and it works. It's like no, somehow that doesn't work. But how do you can you explain that to people or your thoughts on that? It's like you can't have an out of the box insurance thing ready to go because it doesn't work that way either. It's like you need the building blocks that you can reuse. But how would you talk
Right.
about
The building blocks of being like, ask this question and then go to this other one and ask these other two questions, but change how you ask each time. It's not as easy as that. I mean, I want to fall back for a second to the personality traits. Like you said, yeah, sometimes you'll wear a suit or something, you'll come across differently. Even just talking, even if it was just on the phone, when you talk to your doctor, you behave a certain way. When you talk to, where your stature is in relation a sibling, your mom,
that?
um, but if you asked all those people separately about you, they probably would all say that you're a kind person,
I hope so.
or that you're, "Oh, he's funny," or he's, um, like your personality doesn't die just because you're, in a different situation and all that. It will come through. Different parts of your personality might arise to the top, but
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean I think that's where where the difference sits for a lot of stuff. You can't copy paste one bot to the other because it needs to be authentic. And if it's not authentic, people will go through it. Like they'll notice it immediately. So you might have so in this case, the examples like different people meet me in different contexts, but they would generally have the same impression. Whereas maybe sometimes people I don't want to say like I'm super authentic, but like, you know what I mean? Like people sometimes pretend to be something and then it falls flat very quickly. People will notice it. So there's like taking the building blocks and the design patterns and imagining what they could be in your organization versus copy pasting an entire corpus of a different organization, different insurance plan to the yours. So that does not feel authentic, and it will fall flat and people will drop out. So the process of taking the design patterns and reimagining them for your specific brand is what creates an authentic system that people want to interact with versus
Right.
a brainless copy paste. And that's like templates versus building blocks. I think that's kind of like a thing that, because always when we talk about building blocks, people are, oh, so you got templates and we can just, save a lot of save a lot of time and go live. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way.
Well, here's where I like to apply a little lateral thinking to, compare it to a sister field, for example. So at Flipkart, I led a team of regional language experts, and they didn't just translate content into 11 regional languages. They practice what's called transcreation. It goes beyond literal translation. It adapts meaning, tone, cultural nuance. Very, very different areas of India, have different kind of
Yeah.
cultural experience. So in order to have it resonate, you see it all the time in advertising that something like an ad slogan has to really hit the mark or it's useless. And so in order to what works in one country needs to potentially be completely rewritten to work, from scratch in another country, right? So I think for conversation design in specialized domains, it needs to be sort of the same mindset that you can't copy and paste a global best practice and assume it works everywhere. Um, Take, for example, confirmation patterns. Globally, it's a good standard practice to understand that over confirming kind of erodes trust and feels really tedious if you just do it too much. Just that general guideline. But in financial context, we've done research that people actually they want to confirm almost at every step. They want stronger, they expect it, stronger confirmation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it feels careless and unsafe, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of fix of, the risk is treating everything like plug and play. And the
Yeah.
fix, I would say, is maybe we could call it design transcreation. Start with the standard, then adapt it deeply for the domain and culture that it lives in.
Yeah. Yeah. We would always have, so when we design, so there's like, what are you trying to say, then add the basic patterns to it, and then we would always have like this layer of behavioral psychology on top of it. And if we would go to a different country or language, we basically say like, based on behavior psychology, we know like, here we want to have social proof, whatever that means in your thing, like go for it. Like, so you want to like redesign it, but basically follow the main structure rather than just plug and play. Because yeah, like if you say we're gonna zoom in on scarcity here, then we're gonna have social proof here, because that helps with motivation and getting people to where they need to go. That might be very different in the US than in India, than in, I don't know, Italy, and so yeah, you got to leave it up to the local markets. So yeah, you need to have those different countries and teams trained that they all speak the same design language, but then all kind of take it and recreate it. So Flipkart, you let Flippy, a multilingual assistant, 400 million Indians, I think, are interacting with this. So we start a project like that, like what are some of the first design decisions that you might make or that you made to actually, ensure that you got that cultural resonance? Because, there's no one India. You're basically dealing with so many
Right,
different
right.
cultures and languages, etc.
Well, one thing was heading into it not expecting to use something that already existed in any other country or any other context, not to adapt some existing assistant and hope that it would resonate and then tweak it, you know. So that whole 80/20 thing, that wasn't even there. We just it wasn't a solution looking for a problem. It was built for what we called the next 200 million. So they are those who they use their phone for all kinds of things, communication, entertainment, all these other things, but they don't necessarily have a familiarity with the construct of online shopping. Like, how big is this store, and look, how does it work? And you enter something, and then they send it. It just that's that. It was so we called it the next 200 million. So we focused on that user set. So when we did our research, it told us pretty clearly right away that voice had to come first. that, in India, blending, English with regional languages, that's just normal for people. People will speak 2, 3, 4 languages. It's not uncommon. Um, but also transliteration, meaning the Roman character equivalent of spelling out, Hindi
Mm.
words, for example, is really inconsistent. There's no standardization of that. You might use 2 O's here and a U there, that sort of thing. So that made typing a barrier, and then speaking wasn't. So voice input became really natural. So we started in Hindi and English and made that experience accessible from day one that way. Then we also design for empowerment for things like, like I said, it's a massive marketplace, trying to navigate that instead of just throwing, it's just suddenly speech enabled. Instead, we made the assistant kind of have its own little part of the app where they could use
Mm.
voice search and do conversational browsing, ask for things by, type and then brand and so on. But we also found out that, we wanted to pair it with strong visuals because even with literacy uh, differences or language differences, people would recognize packaging, like in grocery shopping. They know that's the package of flour they buy and, they're comfortable with that. So making sure the voice had that visual, it wouldn't just say 12 results, what else?
Mm.
It would show them, right there, so you could see that instant kind of, reaction. So we kept the persona also very minimal, very clear. They didn't need the assistant to charm them at that stage. We weren't going in that direction first. It looked charming, it looked approachable, those are the kinds of things we wanted to do, but we wanted to remove the barriers keeping them in control. So that's how we started with it feeling natural and resonant.
Yeah, and I guess there's also like this very there's all these different languages and cultures, and then because it's also like a first, second, and third world country all in one, and then you get the cities and the rural areas. If you got to map all of that out, like how do you start? Like,
Well, actually, we use the universal inclusive design principle where we anchored on designing for those who needed it the most. So, we wanted to make sure that we design for those who face the biggest barriers and then make just trust that that experience would work for everyone. It's kind of like you have captions for video or those curb cuts in the sidewalk. They're built for accessibility originally, but I don't know anyone who doesn't use captions anymore, and, it's
yeah.
so we kind of applied that same idea to Flippy, so instead of splitting tone into, metro versus tier 3 cities or whatnot, we just focused on that core profile of that next 200 million, and that kinda meant clarity over charm or, guidance over playfulness, respect over familiarity, but it did got the job done. The teams on the project, from the product managers to everyone on the project, kinda had a going thing. Well, they would make sure that their mom could use it.
Yeah.
And it's not that their mom couldn't use technology, because it's their mom's quite savvy with using mobile apps for anything else, so if they could shop also, easily, then that was sort of the way they stay kept themselves in check. But anyway, it worked across the spectrum that way, and making sure that those who needed it the most,
Yeah.
made it more trustworthy.
And then, yeah, because in a way, it's such a specific thing, but then you say we use the inclusion framework and actually feels like, oh, yeah, if you do that, then you check all these boxes. But if you maybe a general, like global framework, and that would be applied in India, like what would they miss? Like if I just come in and I think, I'm Hans, I'm CDI, I know what I'm doing, and I go to India and I start applying my universal stuff there. Like, what are some of the things that I'm really gonna mess up on then?
Well, there's a lot of things like in shopping that I didn't know a lot of. Despite my familiarity with India, I learned that people shop together in groups, and they shop. They love to haggle. It's just a joy of shopping. In a bazaar, just but So I actually went into Flippy kind of intentionally blind that way to see what I could discover, and because I was pretty sure that global framework wouldn't work. So instead, I focused it really honed in on, bifurcating perhaps the user set of okay, we know they're next to 100 million. We know what their limitations are or whatever. Now, we're talking about shopping. What does that mean? So this is where it kind of brought it down to a model of conversation on something far, far older that's really universal, that's been there since the ages of selling, silks and spices on the side of the road. And then, that the relationship between a shopper and a seller is an age-old, real relationship of a model of conversations that tend to look similar across the globe. We looked at it in India a certain way. So shopping in India is social, it's conversational. Like I said, it happens in groups. It involves lots of questions, reassurances, offers, back and forth. So instead of that, global fit trying to, work for India, we actually studied real life exchanges. We went into shops when we were working on the electronics section, for example. We went into a brand electronics store like, Samsung, and then like a big, uh, supermarket or department store kind of, and like actually videotape those scenarios, when and transcribed them and looked at them. When do they jump in? When do they try to upsell? When do they explain versus ask questions about your life to see what fits you? And that was just gold. So we sort of turned these into archetypes. Um, so we came up with seekers, which were, they had a clear purpose of what they're looking for something. I just got a new house. I need a TV. I need it right there,
Yeah.
versus explorers who are browsing.
Yeah.
In fashion, this is especially the case. They come, I need a dress for this party, or I just want to see what's out there right now, what's trending. So the patterns helped us, those patterns helped us shape Flippy's tone a little bit and flow more like that than using any kind of global um, flavor.
That's real. That's really interesting. The thinking now, we were doing a project recently where with one of the Asian super apps, where we also looked at basically the archetypes and then having strategies for the conversation based on behavioral psychology, and kind of what you says, like, oh, this is a seeker versus an explorer, and then this is the behavioral pattern that we're designing for. And we were so impressed, and the client too, with the results of that. And that was done in an LLM powered bot. So for you, if you would now do this again, maybe designing this whole new assistant post Gen AI, or not post, like in the world of Gen AI, what would be different? Maybe would you have the same research going into it, but build it differently? Like, what would you if you start again today?
Yeah, probably if we're talking about a shopping assistant, I'd start the same way. I felt like that was really kind of pure research that we were doing, and, that I'd probably do it the same way we did with Flippy. Begin with lived language and behavior, and then studying how people actually shop. How does a seeker come in with purpose versus an explorer browses with curiosity, right? How do those behaviors intersect with their comfort with technology? What does that change? But, for any post Gen AI assistant, I would be the same as what you're describing. I'd probably, apply that same principle across any verticals. In travel, it's someone booking a familiar route versus, planning an unfamiliar trip that they've never done before. Or in food, it's someone who wants what they want right now at this time, or someone who wants to browse and wants to be courted a little bit in their experience. So
Yeah.
I those archetypes will shift, right? But the principle I think is still the same, like observing real conversations, model them, and then use Gen AI for flexibility and to scale that.
Yeah. Yeah, and in a way, you could also then bring it back to conversations to be done in a way too. It's like,
Yes.
what's the conversation to be done? It's like, I'm shopping for entertainment almost, or I'm just having fun with people, enjoying this as an experience. So that is what the assistant should also deliver of that experience versus the other one that is, I'm shopping to be ready for the party tomorrow. That's why I'm in this store. So I need to get you ready with confidence for that party. Says like, this is gonna be great, and I'm gonna make sure that at the end of this conversation, you're gonna have the confidence that you walk into that party like you're a superstar, and feel confident. And that's the job then of the assistant, where the other ones just take the time and provide entertainment as you're shopping, and I'll try to sell you some things. So yeah, it's fun. It's like if you can always bring it down back to like a few very simple components that are so simple and so complicated at the same time.
Something I would add on to that is that's where our jobs as designers can get really exciting and fun and creative and purposeful, right? Like, take your uh classic example of, if someone's not trying to put a hole in the wall for a
Mm.
hammer, right? They're trying to put in a nail. No, if you zoom even further and further and further out, it's like, what are they actually trying to do? They're trying to create ambiance in their house, or maybe their grandmother passed away and they have this lovely photo that they want their kids to see every day. There's something deeper in their life that they want to do that, has that, yeah, that conversation to be done. That's part of the job to be done.
Yeah, and what I always like about that, what you say, it's like, they're trying to create an ambiance. If you like, zoom out one level or one layer, and then you see all these different things that start to appear. But then if you go even out one more layer, then they're like, oh yeah, when their friends come over, they want their friends to like the house so that they feel socially
Yes.
accepted, and
Yes.
it becomes very simple and universal again. So that's kind of where there's but you need to do the whole lap. You can't simplify it from the start. You need to do the exercise of what's going on and why. Why are they doing that? Why is that important? Why do they care? Why do they care? Oh, it's that same little thing of people being insecure and wanting to be accepted by their friends. But you can't just guarantee it like, "Oh, yeah, I just wanna be accepted," and then sort of design like, it doesn't work that way. You need to put in the work to get there. And then, but now at USAA, you're more thinking probably, yeah, you had the complexity of Flipkart there, and now you're in this world of insurance, so you're more focused on design governance and guardrails and safety. Also very exciting in its own different way, but also very different, of course, that what you were doing before. So what are some governance principles that every conversation design team should probably be thinking about now as we're going into this LLM first world?
Absolutely. So, yeah, it's definitely uncomfortable time where for designers who are, there's these systems coming in that are generating all the words and the dialogue that they don't have control of each and every little thing. But we know the stakes of if those go wrong. So that's where we can come in. And I would say the first shift is moving from those scripts to guardrails. So you can't predict every utterance, you can't predict everything that's generated from an LLM system, right? But you can set boundaries to keep those responses, appropriate, relevant, on brand. Um, USA is nice in the sense that we have such a distinct brand. It's a beloved brand over 100 years old, and people know it for something very specific. So, in a way, that makes this new working with these new systems easier in the sense that, it's a little more black and white, if you will. But we wanna make the second sort of shift is to make the tone systemic. What I was saying before about persona and, all of that tone part, it's not a nice to have anymore, it has to be, those individual traits that we want in there, they can't just live in a style guide anymore. They need to be codified, examples, libraries, things that teach the system how to behave turn by turn. Right? And then there's the actual functional part as well. You might have business rules that say, you need these 3 pieces of information before you can proceed to this other thing. You know, how it's actually, then how it breaks it down, you can give those examples of how to do it. But the third kind of thing is to always remember it seems to always go without saying, but to just remember to design what happens off the happy path. We can come up with some really nice sounding dialogues, right, to show like the vision of where this thing's going to go. But things like that, what I was talking about at the very beginning with it talking forever and giving too many options. So things like neat and tidy turn taking, gracefully repairing, what the escalation rules are. Those are all like those universal mechanics. So I think that, they should be governance decisions. They shouldn't come as fixes later. You should go into it being prepared for those things. And, lastly, I would say from the perspective of voice, check that your systems like that you're whatever you're working with, those out of the box domain assumptions that it's making, because generally I think they're trained on broad context. And so if your company has a product that sounds a lot like something that's completely unrelated, it might, I've seen this where it recognizes something and then your whole conversation falls apart. It sounds really dumb when it's not understanding, you know, I don't know. I like sale item as sailing and then starts talking about travel. This is not the best example, but yeah, it starts to feel really dumb, and no repair strategy you put in there can fix it. So look at your acoustic models as much as you look at your intent. So get involved in those areas because you need to know you can have a really great repair strategy, but if it's trying to repair something that it just sounds really unintelligent to begin with,
Yeah,
you know?
that's actually there's always yeah. I like that because it seems in conversational AI you can never really zoom in on one because it's always like you're trying to fix a journey because people went off track, but it's like a lot of times people shouldn't have been in that journey to begin with at all. So there's never an isolated problem. You always need to look at the whole, zoom out, and understand what's really going on. I see a lot of teams like trying to fix something that actually doesn't need fix like what they're fixing is a consequence of a different problem, which is sometimes much easier to fix, where it's actually like, just take out this word here in your set, and you're good. You won't have that problem anymore. Yeah, that's what I guess that makes it fun, right? It's one big puzzle. You can't isolate little elements in it anymore. It's an ongoing thing. Uh, Talk about like designing for designers. So no, at Flipkart, they told me like tools like Idiom and Harvey giving designers more control and insight. Like, what can you tell us about that and sort of how that helps designers work better?
Idiom and Harvey were tools that I built in partnership with engineering and product to make the whole system work better to where designers were not just handing things over the wall to. So, what we wanted to do was close the gap between intention and execution. So, with Idiom, that was our authoring platform. I had a canvas and you could move things around. You could double click and open up and add prompts and variations and things that we turned the whole model on its head to where designers could actually implement 70% of their work directly. So they didn't have to wait for developer cycles. Nothing got lost in translation. And my special record was that we had at least one thing be able to be fixed from typing to production in 3 minutes. So, being able to have that kind of control was really key. So, but this was sort of a luxury though, because, a big proof point, for Idiom's success is that it wasn't like a hard-won design uh, battle that we won, that we came up with and for ourselves. It was really a collaboration. Engineering, they should be focused on the hard problems, APIs, integration logic, and scalability, all that. And we should be able to have control over wording and flow. But so after the first Flippy release, it kind of conferred like looked back with my engineering director partner and, realized we need something here. And so he actually championed it with me, and we were able to get an architect, a backend,
Mhm.
developer, UI develop. All of those things are kind of a luxury to have. So I can give suggestions on how to do it differently, but I would say that we invested all that time because it was absolutely, I don't think we would have been able to do what we could without it. Um, and Harvey was so Harvey I named it after Harvey Sachs, for conversation analysis. It was a tool that you could look at after production, and you could, pull up
Mhm.
transcripts. You could actually see it just like a chat window right there and see the intents, everything. But it kinda gave us a direct line to real user conversations. Like you were just describing, where you kind of read through and see, like, "I see what went wrong here." It's kind of like
Yeah.
that. And but what was key is we did it as a crew. Every Friday for 2 hours, we had, designers, architects, PMs, engineers, data scientists even, sitting together and reading through, and each person taking back to their team something that they needed to
Yeah.
do. But here's the key is that having a ritual like that, it built empathy into the process. Everyone was always squarely on, just on par with each other, with the real users we were dealing with, and that's something,
Yeah.
it's something you can't manufacture. So anyway, it those tools gave us faster iteration and deeper insight, but, yeah, we were kind of had the luxury of being able to really devote that and those resources to it.
Yeah, I really like that. I think a lot of people don't realize like how big that gap is. Like engineers want to do hard engineering problems. They're not interested in implementing your little chatbot dialogue. So they don't really, it's not, it will never be a priority. It's not the thing they get excited about. And then sometimes designers are so intimidated by the technology that so you end up with this big void, basically this big gap, and that's where a lot of the quality just like it just deteriorates. So empowering your team to actually build stuff themselves and do it properly and then work together with the engineers, it also creates more respect even for the experienced team from the engineering team. So you're going to be better friends because otherwise it's like, well, you have these teams where the designer is really, a former journalist that just wants to write dialogue. You have an engineer that actually wants to do very complicated engineering problems. When they have a meeting to implement a chatbot, like they don't speak the same language. But if you empower the designers to come up to that level more, all of a sudden the whole culture just changes. And we put a lot of emphasis on that for teams. Like, we always talk about mindset, skill set, culture, and systems. So it's like the individual's mindset of how do you perceive your work and the importance of your work and having empathy and curiosity and being humble and wanting to learn, and then the skill set to actually deliver that. But as an organization, it's about, the culture that you have and how do you develop conversational culture. And one of that is doing what you're describing, these sessions where together you go look at what's actually happening here, how are we doing, and people feel involved and committed, and you get more budgets because people get excited about it. And it's usually like in the beginning, you don't have to do it as much, but when you get to a certain scale, this becomes more and more important because it touches so many people. So initially, when you have a small chatbot, send out a weekly news or a monthly newsletter, just updating everybody in the organization, and then maybe do a quarterly, meetup where you tell people about your project, and then you start doing more and more, and eventually you're gonna have executives in the room reading transcripts with you, which is like the coolest thing in the world. And then, you basically create a conversational culture in your organization, and then it really takes off when you get to that scale. Yeah, it's fun that you put that emphasis on there. We it's seems like the companies that do that right do very well, and the ones that struggle with that, like, also just really struggle to understand what I just said of like, why would you do that? Yeah, why would you care? But we have so many big banks that have invested millions into conversational AI, and then nobody of leadership team has ever tried out the chatbot. Like it's just like, somewhere on a spreadsheet, we invest this much for automation. And then it's like a cold automation exercise. Whereas you could turn it into this cool positive thing of like, how are we collectively as a team? We're gonna talk to our customers at scale and make them feel appreciated and buy our stuff and stay loyal. And it's like, yeah, the negative culture versus the positive culture in conversational AI. it has a lot of impact, I guess, on the end results. And the so if you talk a little bit about you're well known, people listening to this. So a lot of people listening to this, they're at enterprises, or there are also a lot of people that are like freelance or just maybe exploring. So you've led these big teams at Google, Flipkart, USAA. What's your advice for someone that wants to move from like being an individual contributor to being seen as a design leader within their organization?
Don't wait around for the promotion,
Mm.
because leadership, you can manifest leadership, far before that. It's a practice. You don't need you don't need a manager title to start leading. My main advice would be to look for gaps that no one else is filling. So these might be things like documenting patterns, mentoring people, pushing for accessibility. Anywhere where you're speaking for the user is key. And then, when you take ownership in those spaces, then people start to see you as a leader long before that title change, right? Um, one Once you've created kind of an opening like that, n- you can also, and I highly encourage to show what good looks like. So even if you don't know where things are going with the project and all that, your vision can give something that everyone else can rally around. Show what you think that vision should be. Show what kind of principles you think you should be adhering to, because be sort of a guiding light to kind of rally around, give people some sort of direction, and of course lift others as you rise. Real leadership is, making sure that peers, they trust you and that you're as invested in them, you know, as much as your own success.
Yeah, that's kind of what they say in startup land too. It's like you find a little niche that is unaddressed and just
Yeah.
basically become a monopolist and own that little niche, and then it will take off. What's something that you've done where basically you probably followed this strategy? So what was the thing for you where you gained a lot of influence and trust with executives? What was the thing that you zoomed in on?
As a whole, I try to make it a point to understand how other roles intersect with my own. So when I first join an organization, the first thing I do for the first 2 weeks is just throw a bunch of one-on-ones on the calendar. Uh, Especially if I'm in a meeting, someone's talking about something, I'm kinda curious about how that might intersect with design. I put something on their calendar and then get to know what it is they do, so I know that what's behind what they're saying, and see where that fits. And you'll always find some sort of common ground. And more importantly, you'll find some, like, basic unspoken trust that starts to build there. So whether it's engineering, product, compliance, I always wanna know how design connects back to those people's goals. And so, I also connect vision and craft constantly. So I put, you know I'm able to, in meetings, whenever I see this and see how people are sort of not putting the things together, I try to show, like, how a single detail ties back to the vision, like, why we're doing it this way. Well, it's we all know this, but, people might not be able to pick up on that little thing. And then, of course, like, speaking for the user, like I said, in critiques, always piping up where how those individual situations you and I were just discussing about, it's different for this person and that, always kind of helping people see the broader picture is really important. And so the combination of respecting others' rules, how they intersect with mine, and then clarity about the impact that what all of us are doing has, kind of builds trust pretty quickly.
What I'm noticing is you're using a lot of the same language as when you're talking about how do you design. It is about, what's somebody's true motivation? What's driving this action? Why are they reaching out? Why are they using this utterance? What's behind it? What is the actual emotional need that somebody has or the business
That's
did?
absolutely right.
And so that's why these skills that you as a designer can learn once you sort of go beyond like how does the technology work? How does this work? Like once you really start looking at like what's really fundamentally happening here, it's like, oh, you have people with certain motivations and certain goals, and I need to interact with them in a way that for my career that if their goals are being met, I'm likely gonna, make my goals and be successful. But it's also the same when I design a bots. Like if I help the customer in a good way, then my brand is also gonna benefit because they're gonna like us more. So it's finding the underlying goals that somebody has and then finding the mutual grounds and then finding like the smoothest path where everybody can be most successful. That's kind of the game.
My favorite, conversation I ever had with a developer is a colleague I still keep in touch with from Google. I was trying to show how the yin yang of design and developers, if they work together, that it's like a symbiotic relationship, kind of like a crocodile and a plover bird, and so I asked him, I said, "What is it you want more than anything else with your work?" And he said, without even hesitating nanosecond, just immediately said, "I want people to use what I build."
Mm,
And I said, "That's perfect because I want people to use what I design. And if I design it, the way I'm hoping will work for them, they will use what you build." And it was from then on like a really solid
yeah,
collaboration.
I really like that. Yeah. There's I don't know if you're familiar with Ken Wilber and integral theory, but they kind of there's like a lot of times when you have a designer and engineer, it always feels like you have opposing viewpoints, and we often go into a dynamic where we're trying to figure out who's right. But what if you just assume that everybody's equally right? And now you just got to find the common ground. So in this case, or want the same thing in this, it's like, all right, I want people to use my stuff, and it's like, okay, great. And you cut through a lot of complicated discussions that you could be having of like, oh, engineering wants that, design wants that, and it can go on for months. So that, and it's like a mature way of talking about these things. So if you're like if I'm a designer and I want to like interview for more senior roles, like how do I speak about a certain design philosophy that might have or system thinking. Like, how do I talk to hiring managers at a more leadership role in these functions that resonates with them? Because now I got to go beyond like, oh yeah, a bot should speak a certain way. Like, how do I articulate a certain design vision in a compelling way?
First of all, don't be abstract about it. Don't be buzzwordy. Um, when you talk about a system, as a whole, and you really want to show how you're thinking, you show your system thinking, show your design philosophy, be really concrete about it. It's not, it- designers have a hard enough time with people thinking design is fluffy and, design is nice to have, but show design is functionality.
Yeah.
Show that scaffolding, decision trees, governance structures, frameworks, those rituals that you want to happen, how you're making it, reproducible, scalable. Um, I had a VP once say, "Where's the pattern? I
Mm.
want to see the pattern." Show how they can imagine it at their scale that they're thinking of, right? Um, Always tie the details that you're doing back to that larger strategy. So, keeping it user centered, connecting that craft of what you're doing to the
Yeah.
outcome everyone else is working toward. I'm asking them this way because they're going to agree to it more likely, which will,
Yeah.
that'll help with containment or, whatever like connect it for people who have those goals in mind, and then they can see how design will be that path to get them there.
Yeah, because a lot of times it'd be like, yeah, we want if at a bank, we want it to be like the old experience when people would walk into the. It's like, yeah, that doesn't mean anything. It's like our goal is to hit these and these numbers in reputation and brand identity. How is this contributing? And then you map it out in detail. And then what are sort of things that you see when somebody's in, when you see a portfolio of someone you're hiring where you're like, okay, this person is ready. Is it being able to articulate at that level of detail? Is that kind of the one thing that tells you they're ready for these roles?
Yeah, I mean, Well, yeah, to tie what they do or what they've done to the why and the how.
Yeah.
A really strong signal for me is someone who can explain and detail their design decisions. Defend it, I guess. Some people
Yeah.
say defend your decisions, but that sounds so negative, but it's more, you know, not just what you chose to do. Here's what it looks like. Here's what it sounds like, but why and what
Yeah.
alternatives that you consider, because that shows depth. It shows empathy, and it also makes. Here's the key for me: is it makes their process something others can learn from,
Yeah.
because someone who can do that on a call with multiple other junior designers, they're gonna all learn from that, and automatically sort of see them. It's method and mindset beyond one person.
I like that because we used to like we would have a lot of times well also and this was not for leadership roles but just in general as a designer because it was like how do you command respect in the room when you're in a meeting with engineers and then you would come in as a designer and be like yeah I want the bot to speak nicely and you're sitting with engineers use very complicated words that you as a designer have no idea what they're talking about so for you to even get some respect in that dynamic was already like that's why we at CDI focus so much on talk about patterns, acknowledgement, confirmation, like the very basic, and give people the language also around persona. Why are things important? Why is tone important? Being able to articulate that just commands respect in the room as well. So it gives it gives confidence to yourself. It teaches others, and it basically creates room for you to do your work as well, which is kind of neat. And then I guess when you get to the higher levels, it's like how does that tie in with the bigger goals and the business goals and what everybody's trying to achieve?
It's really
The
all about language, right? Like, everyone speaks a different language
yeah.
right? One time I actually one time I went as far as, an engineering team that I and PM team, I couldn't quite seem to crack the nut. I when I presented my design, I wrote a Perl script, and then I brought up, like, the command line showing,
Mm,
the conversation going back and forth so that they could just at least know that I can code a little bit. I know,
yeah.
like, how you guys think. We just need to find that common ground, and, it's little tricks.
Yeah, it's like what I do is just as important as what you're doing, and I understand what you're doing. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm one of you. Sometimes we've also like we've where we called someone a design engineer just so that the team would accept rather than just calling conversation designer. It's like a conversational engineer. I was just doing conversation design, but to just make sure that they were accepted in the bigger
Fair,
earth.
yeah.
The another thing that I was thinking about the what some people get wrong, maybe trying to go for these higher roles, especially of larger organizations that like let's say you're at a company like Walmart, whatever. Like if your project does not, if it's not worthy of like if it's not a $50 million change potentially, nobody's interested. Like the numbers get so big at these organizations that like you need to really be like, oh, this you as a designer might find this really important, and it's like, oh, this is going to help with this containment. But if you want the attention of people higher up, you need to speak very big numbers because otherwise, it's not worthy of their time. So sometimes it's like, yeah, it's like having great ideas that work. Wow, okay, now how can you 10x those ideas and speak about it in that way? And the principle, what you're talking about, might actually be worth 50 million but you need to know that yourself because otherwise you're not gonna get the attention of the people that really have to make these decisions. So it's like, yeah, the numbers get bigger and bigger, and they're much bigger than you would think if you kind of
Mhm.
work your way up as a designer. I mean, as we talk about Flipkart, so many millions of users, so many journeys, so many like there's a lot of money at stake here. And so you gotta be mindful of that. So we're kind of getting to the end here. Um, so what's we always have these sort of standard questions that we always close with that are always kind of fun. So what's something that you feel is true about conversational AI that very few people understand or agree with you on?
I don't know if I'll be controversial with saying this, but I believe, conversational AI per se is in its infancy. And I don't think it's on this skyrocket trajectory like, that automatically going to get better with each day. I really think that, LLMs they're astonishing. They've captivated us by making our tasks faster, and we should celebrate that for sure. But, you know, if to me, they're still Play-Doh in the sense that they're flexible, malleable, very exciting, but they're limited if all we do is shape them into slightly new versions of what we've always built.
Yeah.
So I wanna see things change. So, I mean, for decades, right, our handcuffs as designers were scripting conversations ahead of time. If they say this, we say that, right? But real conversations, are dynamic, they're evolving. We negotiate meaning the whole time, and in voice, especially, like I said before, I'm not certain that we've trained enough voice conversations to really be hitting the
Yeah.
needle. That, it's not just in the words. So we're looking at intent, entities, text that's been, transcribed, but so much of the meaning isn't in the words at all. It's in the prosody, the tone, rhythm, the urgency in someone's voice. So, if you've ever argued with your partner about, your tone, then even just how I said that, right, is means something, right? It's packed with some sort of meaning, and it changes that conversation. It's the music in the lyrics. So that richness, I feel like that's lost the moment we flatten that text or the speech
Yeah.
into text, right? And reduce it to an intent. So until we conversational AI can listen and adapt at that deeper level, I feel like we're only scratching the surface. And I hope, that we do go beyond. If you want to stretch the analogy, there are other toys like Goldie Blocks or something like that that they're tied to stories and purpose, for building. But anyway, you know, it's what we need. Like what we need in AI is not the systems that just generate next words, but understand why the conversation matters and adjust to that lived reality in real time, right?
Yeah.
And that's the leap I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, it's like this everybody's always seeing that same promised land, and this is now a big step towards it that gives us confidence that we'll get there, but it's really not as big a step almost. It's like if you know what you're doing, you can do good stuff much faster. But if you don't know what you're doing, you can do a lot of damage much faster too
Mhm.
now with these systems. And there's a lot that needs to happen. But then at the same time, is it good enough now, soonish, if you just look at, from a CX perspective, where it's like, oh, we have customers and they want to do certain things, and can we solve that problem now? That's that's much more attainable than saying we have AI that speaks the way human like do, right? Because I always think like the objective of a chatbot is not to speak the way people speak, because it's to mimic natural language to help customers achieve their goals faster. It's kind of like how people speak in movies and in TV shows. That's not how people speak, but they're elements of natural language. So that's a very different problem statement than saying we want AI to speak the way people speak, right? Because that's very far removed. Is this Are we much closer to solving the CX problem up to a certain level? And then there's a whole new stack of problems that probably opens up as well.
There's speak like people speak, but there's also understand like people understand.
Yeah. And then I would think for CX, you don't necessarily always need that for the majority, for a lot of the use cases where people just want to buy like
They
the
just wanna do the yeah, it's an
yeah.
ask, it's a yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but once you do that, then people get bored, and then you get into that new phase. And then, so if you all the stuff that we talked about, understanding of patterns, empathy, if you're hiring designers or any team members, like what's then the key skill or mindset that you would now look for, particularly in this time and this transitional technologies?
I call it being able to design for dignity. And I'm sure you're sensing a theme here, right? Where, it's not about making the system sound witty or human, it's more about making the user feel that respected, supported, and really key is in control. Because the more AI is out there, there are some people that are embracing it. There are others that are more and more put off by like it's everywhere, right? You want people to feel in control. So it might mean writing in plain language, keeping complexity behind the scenes, all of that stuff. But uh, designers make it second nature or great designers make it second nature to remember those unspoken contexts. All those reasons people come to a conversation. They might have a baby on their hip, they might be late for an appointment, they might be dealing for something really stressful that happened earlier in the day. Knowing that and always kind of keeping that in the forefront and, getting out of just scripting something. So, our job really isn't about getting people to marvel the technology. We're not designing for Yelp reviews, right? It's really helping people, get the job done. So, um, I want a designer that, when I meet someone who can do that, who can translate that kind of empathy into a clear, purposeful choices that they make and they can speak about them that way, then I know that they're gonna thrive.
Yeah. I like that we always say, like, before you create anything, just take a deep breath. And that's because it always, like, rush into the problem. If you're just like, "Okay, what's going on here?" Take a deep breath, calm down. Okay, what are we actually doing here? Just having that little break in between already helps with that. But yeah, well, like you say, for some people it's second nature that just always think about that, and some people just need like a checklist. Think about the customer. It's like, oh yeah, good, go on. And then is that also the skill set that's hardest to find or underrated in the space today, or would that be something else that comes to mind?
I love that you asked that. It's actually two things that I think are really, really key. And the first is world building. So, what I mean by that is designers, they often fall into the trap of writing in their own voice or just filling in a dialogue to match a use case, right? But what we're really doing, is building an entity, a character or entity, but it's more, it's persona, it's brand attributes, it's personality traits, it's functionality, and it's the lived reality of users. So think laterally for a second to other storytelling domains like TV, books, film, right? Great writers don't just throw lines on a page for one particular context, right? They write characters that are in depth and they have consistency. So when you're designing as part of a team, like a design team, like we have 7, 8 designers on our team right now. When you're designing as part of a team, you don't want a Frankenstein persona. You're all designing for the same thing, right? I mean, over 100 people have written for The Simpsons, but somehow those characters have, remained whole. Or an ensemble cast like Friends works because it's not just each distinct one, it's a whole dynamic, right? So you're designing for a whole dynamic. So I think conversation design is the same because every choice you make builds part of that shared world.
Yeah.
And it makes the system consistent. Uh, I'll give you another one, Hans. It's really an overlooked skill, and it's the ability to train others. Let me tell you what I mean. At the end of the day, most of the systems that we've been designing, right, stand in for a human representative, right? It's so the same principles that would guide like how you would coach a call center agent, for example, how they represent the brand, how they carry the voice, how they embody those behaviors. Those are the ones we need in system design because you're training, so if you can think in terms of it's that training outside of yourself, thinking outside of yourself. That's really key. So, I mean, I've always applied that lens because of kind of how the arc that my career took, but um, designing, system behavior, verbiage, all of that, it's part of coaching. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I will even go as far back as say, like, one of my earliest jobs was managing a retail store in college. And I had to train the staff to act as a cohesive brand identity. They all had to sort of use the same greetings and the same,
Yeah.
goodbyes and ask for help. They had to ask for manager under certain circumstances and make those calls, right? So the instincts used to sort of instill consistent behaviors in humans, right? You can use that as a
Yeah.
designer and how systems speak and act for an organization. So this is sort of those two things.
Yeah, I like that. So I also grew up in the contact center world where I worked for like 5 different contact centers, and then I did a COPC training of how to manage a contact center. And I think there's so much knowledge there and expertise and how to sort of get a group of people skilled up and speak the same language and being consistent and measuring that and calibrating people. It's a very important part of the job and understand and basically having that awareness around it. And what you said earlier about, having those nights with the whole team going over transcripts is also part of that calibration and speaking the same language. And yeah, it's like, algorithms need parents too, or like it takes or no, the one that applies here is like it takes a village to raise an AI, and it's like that one culture and everybody's shaping it and working towards it, creating something unique. So even if you're the best designer, then thinking like, oh, just jump in, I'll fix this. Like, no, you're not on your own. You're part of a living entity yourself, shaping an artificial
Yeah.
entity that is always in development. So I guess there's like the maybe almost if you summarize it, is basically being mindful of what it is you're building and and,
Yeah.
and the impact that it has on all those millions of people that interact with it because they all get touched it by it in one way or another. They already have their lives, they already have their days, and then they interact with your AI, and that actually puts a lot of responsibility onto you. And you can look at it and be like, "Oh, it's just a bot." It also doesn't make your job any nicer. You could also go to work every day and feel proud and feel responsible for what it is you're creating and the impact that it might have and how it can help people and how it can help your organization. So then if you're looking, final question as we're wrapping this up, next 6, 12 months, like what's something that you're really going to be focused on at a strategic level?
Well, my main focus, if we talk about AI, is to sort of make sure that this governance that I keep talking about keeps pace with it because
Mm,
the systems are evolving really quickly, but trust kind of which what really matters it is moving more slowly. So I think the challenge is putting those guardrails in place. At USAA, we have our own project and I kind of intend to apply the lens of, you know, that sort of guardrails, tone, escalation, all those patterns that are in there, applying that as we modernize. We're modernizing our conversational platform, in the coming months, but I'll be drawing also from that experience to help shape it long term. That's what I'm hoping for.
mm,
But, more broadly, my focus is on helping the field mature. I wanna be more involved in the industry and kind of equipping designers to think beyond words on the page and more systemically and what I'm calling designing with dignity and baking all those things into the architecture because I really do think it's possible, right? And I see the next 6 months. I mean, things move so fast, right? I see the next 6 months like not just as a time that we could be refining systems, but also to evaluate our principles.
mm.
Tools, these tools that keep changing, systems keep changing and advancing, but if we ground ourselves in those, principles of, what we want that global baseline to be, I
Mm.
think that the systems we build will stand that test of time.
I love that. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts. And as we were ending there, I was like, yeah, you should just create a module with CDI and talk about these things. And then you have access to 15,000 students that are working with CDI and have a lot of impact figuring out and contributing to that field that way. So that'd be a really cool thing to do.
I would love
Uh,
that.
yeah, let's make it happen. And for now, thank you so much. If people want to reach out to you and find you, what's the easiest way for them to do that? Should I find you on LinkedIn or shoot
Yeah,
your email?
LinkedIn's the best one, yeah.
All right. Nandini. Sorry, I did it wrong. Stalker on LinkedIn, super easy to find. I checked earlier today. I have 240 shared friends with you. So that's that. Small industry, yeah. So it's gonna be easy to find. So thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I think it's really great the language that you use, the maturity behind it, and the understanding of it, like the depth of knowledge. So everybody, thank you for listening. Share this with your friends. Follow up, connect with everybody, and let us know what you thought about this wonderful episode of Unprompted. Thank you so much.